The dust was the first thing Clara noticed. It was a fine, red powder that coated everything: the cracked leather of the stagecoach seats, the worn fabric of her only good dress, and the inside of her throat. For 3 days, she had breathed it, tasted it, and felt it grit between her teeth. It was the taste of a new life she had never asked for, a life purchased with her uncle's gambling debts. He had not looked at her when he told her. His eyes, normally shifty and nervous, had fixed on a spot on the floorboards of their cramped Boston tenement. "He's a rancher," Uncle Thomas had mumbled, stuffing a wad of bills into his coat pocket. "A man of property out west. He needs a wife to keep his house. It's a good arrangement. Clara, a fresh start. A fresh start." The words had echoed in her head like a death knell. She was 17, orphaned since the fever took her parents 5 years prior, and now she was little more than chattel. Sold. The word was ugly, but it was the truest one she knew. Her uncle had signed the papers, accepted the money wired from some dusty corner of the Arizona territory, and packed her a small trunk with her mother's Bible and a few threadbare garments. He hadn't even seen her off at the train station. There was no goodbye, only the finality of a transaction completed. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, its creaking wheels groaning in protest. "Harmony Creek!" the driver called out, his voice as rough as the land around them. End of the line. Clara peered through the grimy window, her heart sinking with each detail that came into focus. Harmony Creek was a cruel name for such a place. It was a single dusty street flanked by a handful of sun-bleached wooden buildings that looked as if they were clinging to the earth for survival. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a church with a crooked steeple were the only signs of civilization in a vast, unforgiving emptiness. The land stretched out in every direction, a panorama of cracked earth, skeletal bushes, and jagged mesas shimmering under a sky so big and blue it felt like a weight. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, whipped dust devils down the street and rattled the loose boards of the storefronts. It was a place that felt forgotten by God. Hesitantly, she stepped down from the coach, her worn boots sinking into the thick dust. The few people on the street stopped to stare. A woman in a faded calico dress, her face a mask of weary disapproval, pulled her young son closer. 2 cowboys leaning against the general store's porch railing fell silent, their eyes raking over her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Clara felt her cheeks burn with shame. They knew, of course, they knew. In a town this small, a lone woman arriving on the stagecoach could only be one thing: a mail-order bride, a woman for sale. She clutched her small valise, her knuckles white, and scanned the faces, searching for the man who had bought her, the man whose name was Elias Thorne. The contract had been brief, containing only his name, the location of his ranch, and the confirmation of payment to her uncle. No picture, no letter, no word of welcome. Then she saw him. He was not standing with the others, but was leaning against a water trough near the blacksmith's, separate and solitary. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his simple work shirt. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see he was a man carved from the same harsh material as the land itself, weather-beaten and unyielding. As he pushed himself upright and started toward her, the sunlight caught his face, and Clara drew in a sharp, involuntary breath. A scar, pale and jagged, ran from his left temple down his cheek, disappearing into the rough scruff of his jaw. It was an old wound, but it gave his face a permanent severity, a look of grim endurance. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were the color of a winter sky, a flat, distant gray that held no warmth, no welcome, no emotion at all. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too little for a long, long time. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe. It was not a lecherous look, but it was just as unnerving. It was the look of a man assessing livestock. He was checking his purchase for flaws. "Clara May," he stated. It was not a question. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. She could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. He gestured curtly toward a buckboard wagon hitched nearby. "My wagon's over there." He did not offer to take her trunk or her valise. He simply turned and walked away, expecting her to follow. Clara wrestled her trunk from the back of the stagecoach, the driver offering no help, and dragged it through the dust, her humiliation a physical weight on her shoulders. She felt the town's eyes on her back, their silent judgment following her every step. The ride to the ranch was conducted in a thick, oppressive silence, broken only by the squeak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves. Elias Thorne did not speak, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands steady on the reins. Clara sat rigidly on the hard wooden seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stealing glances at the man beside her. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps not yet 30, but the severity in his face and the silence that clung to him like a shroud made him seem ancient. His hands were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred and broken. They were the hands of a man who did nothing but work and fight. The landscape grew even more desolate as they left the small town behind. The ranch, when they finally arrived, was as stark and unwelcoming as its owner. A simple, one-story house stood in the center of a dusty yard, flanked by a large barn and a few smaller outbuildings. There were no flowers, no garden, not a single touch of softness to break the monotony of brown earth and gray wood. A broken fence post leaned at a sad angle, and the wind moaned as it passed through the eaves of the barn. It was a place of profound loneliness. "This is it," Elias said, pulling the wagon to a halt. He climbed down and began unhitching the horses, his movements economical and precise. Clara remained on the wagon seat, frozen, until it became clear he had no intention of helping her. She clambered down, her legs stiff, and looked at the house that was to be her home. It seemed to watch her with vacant, unblinking window eyes. Inside, the silence was even deeper. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint, clean scent of lye soap and old wood. The main room was sparsely furnished, a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a few rough-hewn shelves on the wall holding a handful of tin plates and cups. Everything was immaculately clean, yet it felt utterly lifeless. There were no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floor, no curtains on the windows. It was not a home, it was a shelter, a place to keep the wind out and nothing more. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was the house of a man who lived with ghosts. The emptiness was not just a lack of furniture, it was a deliberate absence. A space cleared by some great and terrible loss. "Your room is there." Elias pointed to a closed door at the far end of the room. "The kitchen is through there. Water is from the well out back. You'll be expected to cook and clean. I take my meals at sunup and sundown." He delivered the instructions in the same flat, unemotional tone, as if hiring a housekeeper rather than addressing his bride. He met her eyes for a fleeting second, and in their gray depths, she saw a flicker of something, not pain, not sorrow, but a weariness so profound it was like looking into an abyss. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind a mask of indifference. The wedding, if one could call it that, took place the following afternoon. The preacher from town, a thin, nervous man named Reverend Miller, rode out to the ranch. His Adam's apple bobbed as he spoke, and he kept wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. The only other witness was a neighbor, a grizzled old man named Silas, whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and who seemed deeply uncomfortable to be there. He stood with his hat clutched in his hands, his eyes darting from Elias to Clara and back again, his expression a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Clara wore her one good dress, the same one she had traveled in. She had washed it in the basin in her room, but it was still creased and faded. Elias stood beside her in his work clothes, looking not at her, but at some point over the preacher's shoulder. Reverend Miller rushed through the vows, his voice a low monotone that was nearly lost to the wind whistling outside. When he reached the part about the ring, Elias produced a plain, thin gold band from his pocket. It looked old and worn. He took Clara's hand. His touch was rough and cool, sending a shiver through her. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was too big. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher finished. Closing his book with a relieved snap, he cleared his throat. You may kiss the bride." An unbearable silence descended upon the small room. Elias did not move. He simply dropped her hand and looked at the preacher, his expression unchanged. The moment stretched, taut and agonizing. Clara stood frozen, her face burning, her body trembling with a humiliation so acute it was like a physical blow. He was not going to touch her. He would not even grant her that small, public gesture of possession. He had bought her. He had married her. But he would not kiss her. The preacher's face flushed a deep red. "Well then," he stammered, gathering his things. "Congratulations, Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne." The title felt like a mockery. Silas, the neighbor, muttered his own congratulations and escaped out the door as if fleeing a fire. The preacher followed close behind, leaving Clara alone with her new husband in the suffocating silence of the house. That night, she prepared a simple meal of beans and salted pork. They ate at the table without exchanging a single word. The scraping of forks against tin plates was the only sound. When the meal was over, Elias rose from the table. For a moment, he stood there, looking down at her, and Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The house was small. Her room was just a few feet from his. The night stretched before them, a dark and terrifying unknown. But he only inclined his head slightly toward her room. "You're safe here," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle, but filled with an unmistakable finality. "That's all I promised." Then he turned and walked to his own room at the opposite end of the house, shutting the door behind him without a sound. Clara sat at the table for a long time, the cold from the floorboards seeping into her bones. The too large ring on her finger felt like a shackle. She was married. She was Mrs. Thorne, but she was a wife in name only. He had given her his name and the shelter of his roof, but nothing else. She was a fixture, a convenience, another piece of property he had acquired to make his life function. Finally, she rose and went to her own small, cold room. She did not undress. She lay on top of the stiff blankets and stared into the darkness, listening to the lonely cry of the wind. Tears she had refused to shed for days finally began to fall, hot and silent, tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. She was trapped in this empty house with this empty man, in a land that cared nothing for her. She curled into a tight ball, wrapping her arms around herself, as a single, wretched sob escaped her lips. She pressed her face into the thin pillow to muffle the sound, her whole body shaking with the force of her despair. "I'm just the hired bride," she whispered into the darkness, the words a raw, ragged admission of her own worthlessness. Her voice was barely audible, thick with humiliation and a terrible, aching longing for a kind word, a gentle touch, a life that was more than just a loveless bargain. The days settled into a rhythm of silence and hard work. Clara rose before the sun, the chill of the house clinging to her thin nightgown as she stoked the embers in the hearth. Her life became a cycle of chores, each one a small battle against the encroaching dust and decay of the ranch. She scrubbed the wooden floors until her knuckles were raw, kneaded dough for bread that always seemed to taste of loneliness, and mended Elias's work clothes, her needle moving in and out of the rough fabric in the quiet afternoons. The land outside was a constant, oppressive presence. The wind never ceased its mournful song, and the sun beat down on the cracked earth with a relentless fury. The vast, empty horizon mirrored the emptiness in her own heart. She was a solitary ghost in a silent house, married to a man who was more of a phantom than a husband. She learned the contours of Elias's silence, the shape of his routines. He was a man bound to labor, rising with her at dawn and working until the last light had bled from the sky. He moved with a grim, relentless efficiency. Whether he was mending fences, breaking a wild horse, or simply cleaning his rifle on the porch in the evenings. He rarely spoke to her, and when he did, his words were clipped and practical, stripped of any warmth. But she watched him. In the quiet moments, she saw things the contract had not specified. She saw the way he flinched when a log shifted in the fire, a sudden, violent jerk of his body as if bracing for a blow. She noticed how his eyes, when he thought no one was watching, would fix on the distant hills with an expression of such profound pain that it made her own chest ache. He never looked her directly in the eye for more than a heartbeat. His gaze would always slide away, as if contact was something he could no longer bear. He was a man encased in scars, both visible and hidden, and Clara began to understand that his coldness was not a weapon directed at her, but a shield he held up against the world. He was haunted, and his ghosts filled every empty corner of the silent house. One sweltering afternoon, Silas, their grizzled neighbor, rode into the yard leading a sorry-looking mare. The animal was little more than a skeleton draped in hide, its head hanging low, a festering wound on its flank oozing and attracting flies. "Found her by the creek," Silas explained, his pitying gaze flickering toward Clara. "Looks like she was thrown and left for dead. I ain't got the time or the fee to spare. Thought maybe Elias could put her out of her misery." Elias came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He took one look at the horse and gave a slow, grim nod. "I'll take care of it." He went back into the barn, and Clara knew he was getting his rifle. A wave of protest rose in her. She looked at the mare's eyes, dull with pain but with a tiny spark of life still flickering in their depths. The animal had been abandoned, left to suffer, and its fate felt wretchedly familiar. "No," she said, her voice small but firm. Both men turned to look at her, surprised. It was the first time she had ever contradicted Elias. "Please," she said, stepping forward and reaching out a tentative hand to stroke the mare's dusty neck. The horse shuddered but did not pull away. "Let me try. Let me see if I can help her." Silas grunted, looking at Elias for the final word. Elias stared at Clara. His unreadable gray eyes narrowed slightly. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her small frame, her determined expression, and the gentle way her hand rested on the suffering animal. He seemed to be weighing her, measuring a strength he had not noticed before. Finally, he gave another curt nod. "She's your responsibility," he said, his voice flat. "Don't waste my time." He turned and walked back into the barn without his rifle. For the next 2 weeks, the mare became Clara's entire world. She named her Hope, a name that felt like a prayer. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and cloths torn from one of her old petticoats. She coaxed the horse to drink, bringing buckets of fresh water from the well until her arms ached. She begged a small portion of oats from Elias's supply, supplementing it with soft grasses she gathered from the banks of the nearly dry creek bed. She spent hours in the small corral Elias had given her, speaking to the horse in a low, soothing voice, telling it stories of the green fields of her childhood, of a world that was not all dust and wind and pain. Elias never offered to help, but she often felt his eyes on her. She would look up from her work to see him standing by the barn door or near the fence line, watching. He never said a word, but his presence was a constant, silent observation. He watched as the mare, under Clara's patient care, began to heal. The light returned to her eyes. She started to put on weight. And one morning, when Clara entered the corral, Hope lifted her head and gave a soft nicker of welcome. Clara buried her face in the horse's mending neck, a sob of pure, unadulterated joy shaking her. For the first time since arriving in this desolate land, She had saved something. She had nurtured life back from the brink. When she looked up, her cheeks wet with tears, she saw Elias standing by the water trough. He was looking directly at her, and for the first time, his gaze did not slide away. In his eyes, she saw not coldness, but a flicker of something she could not name. It looked almost like surprise. The need for supplies eventually drove her to make the trip into Harmony Creek. Elias had to ride out to check on a distant corner of his property and left her with the buckboard and a small list. Flour, salt, coffee. The thought of facing the town alone filled her with a cold dread. But she loaded a small crate of eggs from the hen house, her own small contribution, and set off, her knuckles white on the reins. The town was just as she remembered it, a place simmering with suspicion. As she tied the wagon up outside the general store, she saw the same women from her arrival gathered on the porch. They fell silent as she approached, their eyes dissecting her patched dress and the nervous set of her shoulders. As she passed, their whispers followed her like biting flies. "That's her, the Thorn woman. Poor thing, can't imagine living out there with him. They say the place is haunted, that he's half mad from what happened. She won't last a month in that haunted place. No woman would—" The words were like tiny, sharp stones hitting her skin. Clara's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin and pushed open the door to the store. The storekeeper, a portly man with a sour face named Mr. Henderson, looked up from behind the counter. "What do you need?" he asked, his tone unfriendly. Clara recited the short list, her voice barely a whisper. He gathered the items, slamming them down on the counter. Then he named the total. "I have some eggs to trade," Clara said, holding up the small crate. Mr. Henderson sneered, barely glancing at them. "I don't do credit with his kind. Cash only, up front." The implication was clear. She was Elias Thorne's wife, and therefore, she was not to be trusted. Her humiliation was so complete she felt dizzy. Her hands trembled as she reached into the small coin purse Elias had left for her. She knew there was enough, but the shame of the accusation, of being treated like a beggar or a thief, was suffocating. Suddenly, the door behind her opened, letting in a shaft of bright, dusty sunlight. Elias stood there, filling the doorway. He must have finished his work early. His face was set in its usual grim lines, but his eyes, when they landed on the storekeeper, were as cold and hard as chips of flint. He said nothing. He simply walked to the counter, took the coin purse from Clara's trembling hand, and counted out the coins. Then he took another handful of coins from his own pocket and placed them on top, nearly double the amount Mr. Henderson had asked for. The storekeeper's sour expression faltered, his face turning a blotchy red. He quickly swept the coins into his drawer, refusing to meet Elias's gaze. Elias picked up the sacks of flour and salt. "Let's go," he said to Clara, his voice low. He did not speak on the ride home, but something had shifted between them. He had stood for her. He had defended her, not with words, but with a quiet, powerful gesture that had silenced the storekeeper's disdain more effectively than any argument. He had seen her humiliation and had shielded her from it. As the wagon rattled along the dusty track, Clara stole a glance at his scarred profile, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a fragile, tentative warmth, a feeling of gratitude that was so new and unfamiliar it almost hurt. That night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. It was a violent, furious tempest that shook the small house to its foundations. Thunder cracked overhead like the sky splitting apart, and lightning lit up the stark landscape in brief, terrifying flashes. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows in their frames. Clara had always been afraid of storms, but this one felt different, more personal. The violence outside seemed to awaken a deep, primal fear inside her. She lay in her bed, curled into a tight ball, her hands over her ears. But she could not block out the sound or the terrifying images it conjured in her mind. She fell into a fitful, dream-haunted sleep, and in her dream, she was back in the Boston tenement. The fever was raging, and she was watching her mother's life slip away. The sound of the thunder became the sound of her uncle's angry voice, telling her she was worthless, a burden, a thing to be sold. She woke with a choked scream, her heart pounding in her chest, the dream clinging to her like a shroud. The room was pitch black, and for a disoriented moment, she did not know where she was. The thunder crashed again, and a raw, animal terror seized her. She was alone, utterly and completely alone in the darkness. Without thinking, driven by an instinct she did not understand, she threw back the covers and stumbled out of her room. The main room was illuminated by a flash of lightning, and in that brief, ghostly light, she saw the door to Elias's room. It was safety. It was the only other human presence in this terrifying, empty world. She pushed the door open and stumbled inside. "Please," she sobbed, the word torn from her throat. Elias was sitting bolt upright in his bed, the storm having clearly woken him as well. In another flash of lightning, she saw the wild, haunted look in his eyes, the look of a man wrenched from his own nightmares. He held a pistol in his hand, pointed toward the door. He saw her then, a small, trembling silhouette in the doorway, her face pale and streaked with tears. His expression shifted, the wildness receding, replaced by a deep, weary confusion. He lowered the pistol. "Clara?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She could not answer. She was shaking too hard, the sobs racking her small frame. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold herself together. But the terror and the loneliness were too much. She was going to fall apart. He said nothing else. He simply swung his legs out of bed, moved to the edge, and held out a hand. It was not a command, but an invitation, a quiet offering in the midst of the storm. Hesitantly, she took a step forward, and then another, until she was standing before him. He took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers, and gently pulled her down to sit on the edge of the bed beside him. He did not speak. He simply shifted, turning toward her, and drew her against his side. He wrapped an arm around her shaking shoulders, pulling her close. His body was warm and solid, an anchor in the terrifying darkness. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his rough cotton shirt, and cried. She cried for her lost parents, for the life she had been denied, for the humiliation of being sold, and for the profound, crushing loneliness of her new existence. And Elias held her. His hand rested on her back, large and firm, his touch surprisingly gentle. He did not pat her or try to soothe her with empty words. He simply held her, absorbing her grief into his own vast silence, his steady presence a shield against the storm both outside and within her. For the first time since she had arrived, Clara did not feel like a hired bride or a piece of property in the arms of this scarred, silent man. She felt something else. She felt safe, and as her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she realized that something unspoken had passed between them in the dark, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain, a connection forged not with words, but with a simple, grounding touch. The night of the storm changed the silence between them. It was no longer a void, but a shared space that held the memory of her tears and his quiet comfort. In the days that followed, Elias began to draw her into the wider orbit of his work. It started with small things. He asked her to hold a lantern while he set a splint on a calf's leg in the dim light of the barn. He showed her, with brief, economical gestures, how to mix the feed for the cattle, a task he had always done himself. Soon, she was riding out with him in the buckboard to mend the far fences, her job to hand him staples and hold the posts steady while he worked the wire stretcher. They rarely spoke during these long hours under the relentless sun. Their communication was a language of shared glances, of tools passed from one hand to the other, of a canteen of water offered and accepted with a nod. In these stretches of companionable quiet, Clara began to see the ranch not as a prison, but as a vast, living thing that Elias tended with a fierce, lonely devotion. She saw the skill in his calloused hands, the deep knowledge in his eyes as he scanned the horizon for rain clouds, the weary slump of his shoulders at the end of a 16-hour day. She was no longer just the woman who cooked his meals. She was a witness to his struggle, a small part of his relentless battle against the harshness of the land. The fear she had once felt in his presence began to soften, replaced by a tentative, budding respect. One afternoon, while Elias was out checking on a remote well, Clara decided to tackle the thick layer of dust that coated a heavy oak chest of drawers in his bedroom. It was the one piece of furniture she had never touched, feeling it was too personal, a boundary she should not cross. But the dust was an offense to the clean, sparse order of the house. Steeling herself, she entered the room. It was even more Spartan than hers, containing only a bed, this chest, and a single chair. The top drawer was stuck fast. She pulled and wiggled it, her frustration growing, until it finally gave way with a screech of dry wood. It was empty, save for a small object tucked away in the far back corner. Her fingers closed around it. It was a photograph, a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. Its edges were blackened and curled, and a smoky film obscured much of the image, as if it had been pulled from a fire. Clara wiped the glass with the edge of her apron, her heart starting to beat a little faster. Through the haze of soot, 3 figures emerged. A younger Elias, his face unmarred by the scar, was smiling. It was a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face, making him look hopeful and boyish. Standing beside him was a woman with dark, kind eyes and a gentle mouth, her hand resting on his arm, and sitting on Elias's lap, her small arms wrapped around his neck, was a little girl of no more than 4 or 5, with bright, laughing eyes and a tumble of dark curls. A family. His family. A wave of understanding washed over Clara, so powerful it made her dizzy. The empty house, the profound silence, the haunted look in his eyes, it all snapped into focus. He had not always been this way. He had known love, had known the warmth of a wife and the joy of a child, and he had lost it all, lost them all. The burned edges of the photograph were not just damage. They were a testament to the tragedy that had hollowed him out, leaving behind the scarred, silent man she knew. She gently pushed the drawer closed, leaving the photograph where she had found it, a secret she now shared with the ghosts of the house. The pain in her husband's eyes finally had a name. A few weeks later, a rider approached the ranch. It was Sheriff Brody from Harmony Creek, a tall man with a walrus mustache and weary eyes. Elias met him in the yard, and Clara watched from the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thorn," the sheriff said, not dismounting. "Just thought you should know. They let Jedediah Kane out of the territorial prison last month." Elias's body went rigid. It was a subtle shift, but Clara saw the muscles in his back tighten under his shirt. "Heard he was seen asking questions over in Prescott," the sheriff continued, his voice low and serious. "Asking about you. You're the one who testified, the one that put him away. Jedediah Kane." The name sounded like a rattlesnake's warning. Clara felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. Elias stared out at the horizon, his jaw tight. "I'm aware of who he is. Brody." "Just be watchful," the sheriff warned. "Kane's the kind that holds a grudge until it rots. He blames you for that fire, for everything." He tipped his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, nodding to Clara before turning his horse and riding away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy sense of dread in his wake. Clara stepped out onto the porch. "Elias, who is he? What fire?" "It's nothing that concerns you," he said, his voice clipped and harsh, shutting down the conversation before it could begin. He turned and strode toward the barn, his shoulders set in a line of stubborn refusal. Clara was terrified. The vague threat of the lawless land suddenly had a name and a face. A man who was heading their way with vengeance in his heart. And Elias, consumed by his own ghosts, was refusing to even acknowledge the danger. That night, she lay awake for hours, listening to the wind, imagining footsteps in the darkness outside. The annual Founders' Day dance in Harmony Creek was the biggest social event of the year. Silas's wife, Martha, a kind, bustling woman who had taken a liking to Clara, insisted she attend. "You can't stay cooped up on that ranch forever, child," Martha had said, pressing a length of blue ribbon into Clara's hand. "You're a married woman now. You need to be seen with your husband. It'll quiet the gossips." The thought of facing the townspeople again made Clara's stomach churn, but the thought of a night of music and light, a brief escape from the oppressive silence of the ranch, was a powerful lure. To her astonishment, when she hesitantly asked Elias about it, he agreed with a simple, non-committal shrug. She spent the entire day preparing. She washed her hair with lye soap and brushed it until it shone. She mended a small tear in her one good dress and sewed on the blue ribbon Martha had given her. When she looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror in her room, she saw not a hired bride, but a young woman with a hopeful flush on her cheeks. For a few hours, she allowed herself to pretend she was like any other wife, going to a dance with her husband. The town hall was alive with the sound of a fiddler and the rhythmic stomp of boots on the wooden floor. Lanterns cast a warm, golden glow over the crowd. For a moment, Clara was mesmerized. It was more life than she had seen in months. Elias stood awkwardly by the door, a solitary island in the sea of cheerful townsfolk. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. Clara, however, was determined to try. She accepted a cup of punch and even managed to smile at Martha. She saw some of the other ranchers' wives gathered in a corner and, taking a deep breath, she walked toward them, hoping for a kind word, a moment of inclusion. She recognized Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, a woman with a perpetually sour expression. As Clara approached, their conversation died down. They all turned to look at her, their eyes cold and judgmental. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If it isn't Mrs. Thorne." She said the name with a heavy, sarcastic emphasis. Another woman tittered. "I'm surprised he let her out of the house. I suppose he had to make sure his investment was being seen." "Is it true he bought you for $50? A third woman asked, her eyes wide with malicious curiosity. "My husband says that's a high price for a hired girl." The word struck Clara with the force of a physical slap. Hired, investment. The warmth of the room turned to ice. The music seemed to fade away, replaced by a roaring in her ears. Their faces swam before her, a blur of scorn and mockery. She was a fool to have come here, a fool to think a new ribbon could change what she was. She was nothing more than a transaction, a piece of gossip for their cruel amusement. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, choked her. She turned and fled, pushing her way through the crowd, ignoring Martha's concerned call of her name. She ran out of the hall, out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. She did not stop until she reached the small, slow-moving creek at the edge of town, its banks lined with cottonwood trees that whispered in the breeze. There, in the darkness, she sank to the ground, wrapped her arms around her knees, and let the silent, burning tears of shame fall. She did not know how long she sat there before she heard the crunch of boots on the gravel behind her. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Elias stood there, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. He did not speak for a long time, simply stood a few feet away, giving her the space to cry. The silence was different this time. It was filled with his presence, a quiet, watchful waiting. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. I should not have brought you here. It's not your fault, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. They're right. It's what I am. He moved closer and sat on the ground near her, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the heat of his body. He stared at the dark water, his scarred profile etched by the moonlight. When I came back from the war, he began, his voice barely audible over the sound of the creek. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. He paused, and Clara knew he was speaking of the fire, of the wife and child in the charred photograph. After that, I swore I'd never have a wife again, never have a family. There was no point. This house, this land, it was just a place to wait for the end. I was hollowed out. There was nothing left inside. He turned his head to look at her, and in the dim light, she saw an agony in his eyes that stole her breath. I only agreed to this arrangement for appearances, he admitted, his voice raw. To stop the questions. I never intended for any of this, but then you came. You're so quiet, but you're not weak. The way you cared for that horse, the way you work without complaint. You have a gentleness, a kindness that I thought had been burned out of the world entirely. I try to ignore it, but I can't. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching her tear-stained cheek. His touch was like a brand, sending a shock of warmth through her. He slowly leaned in, his gaze searching hers, and then he kissed her. It was not a rough or demanding kiss. It was achingly gentle, tentative, filled with all the unspoken pain and longing that had filled the silence between them for months. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and sorrow and a fragile, burgeoning hope. For a heartbeat. Clara allowed herself to melt into it, to feel the startling intimacy of it. But then the voices of the women came rushing back, hired, bought. The kiss felt like a lie, another part of a transaction she did not understand. What did he want from her? What was this? Pity? A moment of weakness? It was too much, too confusing, overwhelmed. She broke the kiss and scrambled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I can't, she cried, the words torn from her. I'm just the hired bride. The words, her shield and her shame, hung in the air between them. She expected him to get up, to turn away, to retreat back into his cold, silent world. Instead, his face crumpled, the stoic mask falling away to reveal the broken man beneath. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. It was the sound of a man clinging to his last hope. No, he said, his voice breaking. You're more than that. You're the first thing that's made me feel alive in years. Elias's words by the creek that night had been a stone dropped into the still, deep well of their silence. The ripples spread through the following days, subtly changing everything. He had said she made him feel alive, and the confession, raw and broken, had given her a sliver of ground to stand on. It was no longer his ranch she lived on. It was theirs. A fragile, unspoken partnership had been forged in the moonlight. And with it, a new and unfamiliar strength began to take root in Clara's heart. She had been sold. Yes, but she would not be worthless. The change began to show in small ways. She no longer averted her gaze when she passed him in the yard. She met his eyes, holding them for a moment longer each time. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, but it had lost its timid, questioning edge. She was the mistress of this house, and she began to act like it, not with arrogance, but with the simple, steady confidence of someone who knows their purpose. Her first real test came a week later, when Silas and Martha's youngest son, a boy of about 15, came galloping into their yard, his face pale with panic. "It's Ma," he gasped, sliding from his horse. "The new heifer. She's birthing, but it's not right. The calf is stuck. Pa's away at the cattle auction. And Ma, she's all alone. She sent me for you, Mr. Thorne." Elias was already moving toward his horse, but Clara stepped out onto the porch. wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "I'll go," she said. Both Elias and the boy turned to stare at her. "You," Elias said, his brow furrowed. "Clara, it's messy work, difficult." "I helped the vet with my uncle's cows back east," she said, a small lie that felt necessary. In truth, she had only watched, but she had watched carefully. "Martha shouldn't be alone." She looked at Elias, her expression unwavering. "I can do this." Something in his eyes shifted. The surprise was still there, but it was mingled with a grudging respect. He gave a single, curt nod. "Take the buckboard. It's faster." The scene at the neighbor's barn was one of strained panic. The heifer was bellowing in pain, and Martha, her face slick with sweat and tears, was trying in vain to help. "Oh, Clara, thank the Lord," she sobbed. "I don't know what to do. I think the calf is coming out wrong." Clara took a deep breath, pushing down her own fear. She spoke in a low, calm voice, washing her hands and arms thoroughly in the bucket of hot water Martha had prepared. She examined the animal gently, her small hands surprisingly steady. The calf was breech, one hoof forward, the other leg and head twisted back. It was a death sentence for both mother and child if nothing was done. For the next hour, she worked with a focus she didn't know she possessed, following a half-remembered piece of advice from the old vet. She had Martha help her push the calf back just enough to give her room. It was grueling, bloody work. Her arms ached until they were numb, and the heifer's cries of pain tore at her heart. But she did not falter. With patient, determined effort, she managed to find the other leg, to turn the calf's head, and then, with one final, desperate pull in time with the mother's contraction, the small creature slid free. Silence fell over the barn, broken only by the exhausted panting of the heifer and Clara's own ragged breaths. The calf lay still for a terrifying moment, and then it gave a weak cough and lifted its head. Martha burst into tears of relief, throwing her arms around Clara's shoulders. "You saved them," she wept. "Clara, you saved them both." When Elias arrived an hour later, drawn by a worry he would not have admitted to, he found Clara sitting on a stool, sipping water, while Martha fussed over the new mother and her healthy calf. The story of her quiet competence spread through the valley faster than a prairie fire. The next time she went to town for supplies, a few of the other ranchers' wives, women who had previously ignored her, nodded in greeting. "Mrs." Henderson still sniffed with disdain, but Clara found she no longer cared. She had earned a different kind of currency in this harsh land, not the kind paid in coin, but in respect. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed across the horizon, Clara turned to Elias. "I want you to teach me how to use a rifle," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "And I want to learn how to ride properly," she continued, her voice steady. "Not just sit on a wagon seat. I need to be able to get around on my own. If something were to happen, if you were hurt, I can't be helpless. I won't be." He was silent for a long time. Studying her face, he saw the new steel in her eyes, the firm set of her jaw. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach. This was a woman determined to claim her own survival. "All right," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Tomorrow morning, after chores." The lessons became a new part of their routine. The rifle was heavier than she could have imagined, its cold metal a stark reality against her shoulder. The first time she fired it, the recoil knocked her backward into the dust, and the explosive crack made her ears ring. Elias said nothing, simply helped her up, dusted her off, and showed her how to brace herself, how to lean into the weapon and make it an extension of her will. He stood behind her, his hands covering hers on the stock, his body a warm, solid presence against her back. He smelled of leather, dust, and gunpowder. His quiet instructions in her ear were the most intimate words he had ever spoken to her. Riding was a different kind of challenge. He put her on Hope, the gentle mare she had nursed back to health. But Clara was still terrified of the animal's power, the height from the ground. Elias taught her patience, how to communicate with pressure from her knees, with a gentle pull on the reins. He walked alongside her for days, his hand resting on the bridle, his steady presence a balm to her fear. Slowly, her terror gave way to exhilaration, the feeling of the horse moving beneath her, of the wind in her hair as they trotted across the open plains, was the purest form of freedom she had ever known. Their bond deepened in these shared moments of vulnerability and trust. A new language grew between them, spoken in the quiet nod of approval when she hit a tin can from 20 paces, in the small, rare smile that touched his lips when she finally cantered across the yard without fear. The physical space between them dwindled, their hands brushing as he adjusted her grip on the rifle, his arm steadying her as she mounted her horse. The air between them grew thick with unspoken things. One evening, after a long day of working side by side to repair a collapsed section of the barn roof, they ate their dinner in a comfortable, weary silence. The physical labor had left them both exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes from shared purpose. After she had cleared the plates, Clara turned to go to her room, but she stopped, her hand on the door. She looked back at him. He was watching her, his gray eyes dark and intense in the lamplight. He rose from the table and walked toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He raised a hand and gently, almost reverently, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers, calloused and rough, were impossibly tender against her skin. "Clara," he whispered, and her name was a prayer on his lips. Fear and desire warred within her, a dizzying, terrifying combination. She thought of the contract, of the women at the dance. "I'm the hired bride." But then she thought of his words by the creek, of his hands guiding hers on the rifle, of the look in his eyes right now, a look of profound, aching need that mirrored her own. He did not kiss her. He simply waited, giving her the choice. It was the greatest gift he could have offered. Slowly, she lifted her own hand and placed it on his chest, over the steady, heavy beat of his heart. It was all the answer he needed. He led her to her room. He undressed her with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. He treated her not like property, but like a treasure he was unearthing for the first time. Every touch was a question, every stroke a discovery. When they finally came together, Clara shook from a combination of fear and a pleasure so intense it was almost pain. He held her, whispering her name over and over, his movements tender and patient, as if he were trying to memorize the very feel of her. In his arms, she was not a bargain or a convenience. She was his salvation, and he, she realized with a startling clarity, was hers. Their intimacy grew, weaving itself into the fabric of their days. They were no longer two lonely people living in the same house, but a man and a woman building a life. Yet, a shadow remained. A ghost sat with them at the dinner table and lay between them in the bed. He never spoke of his first wife or his daughter. Their names were a locked room in his heart, and he refused to give her the key. Clara would sometimes see him staring at the spot where the cradle must have been, or touching the scarred wood of the mantelpiece where a family portrait might have hung. In those moments, he would retreat into himself, the wall of his grief rising between them, cold and impenetrable. She began to feel like a trespasser, a pale imitation of the woman he had truly loved. She was a comfort, a solace, but was she a replacement? The burned photograph in his drawer became a symbol of her insecurity. One day, she took it out again, staring at the smiling face of the woman with the kind eyes, at the laughing little girl in Elias's arms. They were his real family. What was she? The question festered inside her, a painful thorn. Her newfound strength demanded answers. She could no longer live in the shadow of a ghost. That night, as they lay in the darkness after making love, his arm draped possessively over her. She found her voice. "Elias," she began, her own heart pounding. "We need to talk about them." His body tensed beside her. "There's nothing to say." "There is everything to say," she insisted, sitting up and turning to face his silhouette. "You love someone who's gone. I feel her in this house every day. I see her in your eyes. She's still your wife. What am I? What am I to you?" The words tumbled out, full of hurt and confusion. "Am I just a comfort? A warm body in your bed to keep the ghosts away at night?" He flinched as if she had struck him. He sat up, swinging his legs out of the bed, putting his back to her. The muscles were knotted with a pain she could feel across the room. "Don't!" he rasped, his voice choked. "I have to," she pressed, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't live like this. Elias, I can't compete with a memory. You have to let me in, all the way. Or you and we're nothing but a lie." He stood up, a great wounded silhouette against the window. For a moment, she thought he would turn, that he would finally break his silence and tell her everything. Instead, without a word, he pulled on his trousers and walked out of the room, closing the door quietly behind him. He did not slam it. The quiet click of the latch was somehow more final, more devastating. He had walked away, leaving her utterly alone in the darkness. Meanwhile, miles away, hidden in a rocky outcrop that overlooked the ranch, a man lay watching the faint lamplight in the windows. Jedediah Kane ran a thumb over the handle of his knife, his eyes cold and patient. He had watched the woman learning to shoot. He had watched the man teach her to ride. He had seen them working together, living together. It only deepened his hatred. Thorn had taken everything from him, and now he had built a new life. Kane smiled, a cruel, mirthless twisting of his lips. He would let Thorn enjoy his new wife for a little while longer. He would let him feel he was safe, and then he would burn it all to the ground, just like before. Back at the ranch, Clara's nights became restless. The rift with Elias was a cold chasm between them. He slept in his own room again. The silence of the house once more, an oppressive weight. She began to have nightmares, fleeting images of fire and a man's cruel, laughing face. During the day, a persistent, prickling unease settled over her. She would be hanging laundry or drawing water from the well and would get the distinct, terrifying feeling that she was being watched. Hope would shy and spook at unseen things near the fence line. She tried to tell Elias, her voice trembling slightly. "I feel like there's someone out there. It feels like we're being watched." He was cleaning his rifle on the porch, his movements stiff and angry, still wounded by their confrontation. He didn't look at her. "It's just the wind. Clara," he said, his voice flat and dismissive. "You're letting your imagination run away with you." He was so consumed by the ghosts of his past, so lost in the pain she had forced him to confront, that he could not see the real and present danger gathering like a storm cloud on their horizon. The morning Elias left was heavy with an unspoken tension. He was riding to the far northern pasture to round up a few stray cattle, a trip that would take him the entire day. The argument from nights before still hung between them, a cold, invisible wall. He had saddled his horse in a grim silence, his movements stiff and remote. As he mounted, he had paused, looking at her where she stood on the porch, and, for a fleeting moment, his mask had cracked. She saw a flicker of regret, of a desire to speak, but the habit of silence was too strong. He simply nodded curtly and rode away, a solitary figure shrinking against the vast, empty landscape. Clara watched him go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The feeling of being watched, the one he had so readily dismissed, was stronger than ever today. It was a physical presence, a prickling on the back of her neck that made her want to run inside and bolt the door. She tried to shake it off as foolishness, a side effect of their estrangement. She busied herself with chores, scrubbing the floors with a frantic energy, trying to silence the fearful voice in her head. But every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind in the dry grass, made her jump. By mid-afternoon, the sun was a white-hot eye in the sky. She was in the small chicken coop, gathering eggs. When she heard it, it was not the familiar sound of the wind or the lowing of cattle. It was the soft, deliberate snap of a twig from the direction of the cottonwood grove near the creek. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her hand hovering over an egg, every muscle in her body screaming. She told herself it was a deer, a coyote, anything but what she feared most. Then she heard another sound, the soft, metallic click of a rifle's hammer being cocked. Terror, pure and absolute, seized her. Jedediah Kane. The name exploded in her mind. Elias's dismissal echoed in her ears. It's just the wind. Clara, he was wrong. She was alone. Her mind raced, panic giving way to a desperate clarity born of the lessons Elias had taught her. The house was a trap. It had windows, doors that could be kicked in. The barn was her only chance. It was solid, with thick walls and a heavy, bearable door. And inside, resting on a set of hooks just inside the entrance, was the rifle. She slipped out of the coop, keeping low, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. She forced herself to move deliberately, not to run, fighting the instinct to scream. She reached the wide barn door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely lift the heavy wooden latch. She slid inside, into the familiar gloom that smelled of hay and animals, and her first sob of terror escaped her lips. But there was no time for tears. She fumbled for the heavy bar and dropped it into place. It settled with a solid, reassuring thud. For a moment, she sagged against the door, gasping for breath. Then she remembered the rifle. Her hands found it on the hooks, the metal cool and heavy. It was loaded. Elias always kept it loaded. She checked the chamber, her fingers moving stiffly, mimicking the actions he had shown her 100 times. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a woman holding the only thing that stood between her and death. She heard his footsteps now, slow and deliberate, crunching in the dust outside. He was circling the barn, testing it. A low, mocking chuckle drifted through the cracks in the wall. "I know you're in there, little bird," a voice called, a gravelly, cruel sound that made her skin crawl. "Your man ain't here to protect you. He left you all alone, just like he left the other one." Clara clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. He was talking about Elias's wife. He was the one, the fire. She scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, her boots slipping on the rungs. The loft offered a better vantage point, a small window that looked out over the yard. She crawled on her stomach through the scratchy hay, positioning herself by the opening. Her body was trembling uncontrollably, but her hands on the rifle were surprisingly steady. She rested the long barrel on the sill, just as Elias had taught her. She could see him now, a tall, rangy man with a cruel, unshaven face. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the house. He had a rifle of his own, and a large knife strapped to his belt. "Come on out, Mrs. Thorne," he taunted, his voice dripping with venom. "It'll be easier on you. I just want to have a little chat before I burn this place down around your ears." A family tradition, you might say. Clara's fear solidified into a cold, hard rage. He would not do this again. He would not take this home from her. This life she had so painstakingly begun to build. She would not be a helpless victim cowering in the dark. She lined up the sight on his shoulder. She didn't want to kill him. Not yet. She wanted to stop him. She wanted him to feel pain. She took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. Kane yelled out, a sharp cry of pain and surprise, and staggered back, dropping his own rifle as he clutched his left shoulder. Blood blossomed through the fabric of his shirt. But he was far from finished. A look of pure, murderous fury twisted his features. "You little witch!" he snarled, drawing the knife from his belt. He was no longer toying with her. He charged the barn door, throwing his good shoulder against the thick wood. The door shuddered, the bar groaning in its brackets. Clara fumbled to reload, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. The bullet, the heavy bar, the solid wood of the barn. It was all just buying time. He was going to get in. She looked around the loft, her eyes searching for another weapon, another option. Her gaze fell on the thick rope and pulley system used for hauling hay bales into the loft. An idea, desperate and terrifying, formed in her mind. The bar on the door splintered, then broke, with a final, crashing blow. The door swung inward. Kane stood there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, his face a mask of pain and rage, the knife gleaming in his hand. He saw her in the loft, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. Nowhere left to run. He started for the ladder. As he placed his foot on the first rung, Clara, acting on pure instinct, cut the rope holding a heavy bale of hay suspended near the loft's edge. The bale swung down like a giant pendulum, catching Kane in the chest and sending him flying backward into the dust. He landed with a grunt. The wind knocked out of him. It was the only chance she would get. She scrambled down the ladder, the now reloaded rifle in her hands. She had to get out, to get to open ground. But as she reached the bottom, her boot snagged on a loose floorboard. She cried out as she fell, the rifle clattering from her grasp and sliding into the shadows under a pile of empty sacks. She looked up to see Kane staggering to his feet, the knife still in his hand. He was between her and the door. He was between her and the rifle. She was trapped. He advanced on her slowly, savoring the moment. "You were clever," he rasped, his shoulder bleeding freely. "I'll give you that, but now it's over." She backed away, stumbling over buckets and old tools until her back was pressed against the rough wood of a horse stall. He lunged. She dodged, a scream tearing from her throat, and his knife sliced through the fabric of her sleeve, cutting a deep, burning gash in her forearm. Pain, sharp and searing, shot up her arm. She cried out, clutching the wound as blood began to soak her dress. He cornered her again, his eyes gleaming with a sick triumph. He raised the knife for the final, killing blow. Clara closed her eyes, a single, devastating thought filling her mind. Elias. And then, a sound that was not the wind, not Kane's ragged breathing, but the thunder of galloping hooves. A horse skidded to a halt in the yard, and a voice roared a single word, a sound of pure, primal fury. "Kane!" Kane froze, the knife held aloft, his head snapping toward the sound. Elias was there, leaping from his horse, his face a terrifying mask of rage. He must have had the same feeling she'd had, a premonition that had turned him back early. He saw Clara, bloodied and cornered. He saw the knife, and he broke. He launched himself at Kane with a guttural roar, moving faster than Clara had ever seen him move. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Elias's fists, hard as stone from years of labor, rained down on Kane's face and body. The knife clattered to the ground. Elias was a man possessed, all the years of grief and repressed rage unleashed in a storm of brutal, focused violence. He was going to kill him. "Elias, stop!" Clara cried, her voice weak. "Stop!" Her voice seemed to cut through his rage. He froze, his fist raised, and looked from the battered, unconscious form of Jedediah Kane to her. He saw the blood pouring from her arm, her pale, terrified face. The fury drained out of him, replaced by a horror so profound it seemed to shatter him from the inside out. He stumbled toward her, falling to his knees before her. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over her wounded arm as if he were afraid to touch her, afraid she would break. And then, for the first time since she had met him, Elias Thorne began to cry. Great, silent, racking sobs shook his entire body. He buried his face in her lap, his shoulders heaving. He gently gathered her into his arms, cradling her as if she were made of spun glass. He held her close, his tears soaking the front of her dress. "I nearly lost you," he choked out, his voice raw with a pain that went far beyond the violence of the last few minutes. "I won't survive that again. I can't." The agony in his voice was a physical thing, a wound that tore through her own pain and fear. She looked down at his dark head, at the strong shoulders that were now trembling with a grief he had held inside for years. She lifted her good hand and rested it on his hair. "You touched me like I was your salvation," she whispered, her voice shaking with exhaustion and emotion. "Please, please don't let me be your regret." Her words broke the last of his defenses. He looked up at her, his face ravaged, his gray eyes swimming with tears. The wall was gone. The ghosts were no longer shadows. They were standing with them in the blood-dusted light of the barn. "Regret," he said, his voice a broken rasp. "Clara, you don't understand." He took a shuddering breath, the confession he had held back for so long finally spilling out of him. "Her name was Sarah, my wife, and my daughter. My daughter was named Lily." He spoke their names as if they were fragile relics, easily broken. "Cain and his brothers, they were rustlers. I caught them on my land. I was young, arrogant. I testified. I thought the law would handle it, but Cain swore he'd get his revenge. I didn't listen. I didn't believe him." His voice cracked. "I was in town, buying supplies. I was late getting back. A storm was rolling in. I remember I bought Lily a piece of candy. I was thinking of her smile when I rode into the yard and saw the smoke." He squeezed his eyes shut, but the tears leaked out from under his lids. "The house was an inferno. Cain was there, on his horse, just watching it burn, laughing. I was too late. I couldn't get to them. I could hear them. God, I could hear them screaming." He buried his face in her lap again, his body shaking. Clara held him, stroking his hair, her own tears falling freely, mingling with his. She was no longer just a witness to his pain. She was a part of it. "The guilt," he whispered. "It's a living thing. Clara, it's been eating me alive for 6 years. I wasn't there to protect them. It was my fault. So I made a vow. I would never love again. I would never let anyone close. I didn't deserve it. And I couldn't bear the thought of failing someone like that again, of losing someone." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "When I saw him standing over you, with that knife, it was all happening again. And I knew that if I lost you, there would be nothing left of me at all. Don't leave me. Clara, please, I'm begging you, don't leave me to the ghosts." She listened to his broken, halting confession, and a profound realization settled over her. As he spoke of his weakness, of his guilt and his fear, she felt her own strength solidify within her. She looked at her bloody arm, at the unconscious outlaw, at the rifle lying in the shadows. She had been terrified. Yes, but she had not been helpless. She had fought. She had defended their home. She had survived. The fragile girl who had been sold to settle a debt was gone, and in her place was a woman who could face down monsters, both real and imagined. A woman who could hold a broken man in her arms and not be broken herself. She leaned down and gently kissed his tear-soaked cheek. "I'm not going anywhere. Elias," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a strength that neither of them had known she possessed. "We're not going to live with the ghosts anymore." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. "We'll tie him up and take him to the sheriff," she said, her tone practical, grounding. "Then we'll come back here. We'll clean my arm. And then we are going to rebuild. Not just the barn door. Elias, everything. But this time, we build it on trust, not on pain." He stared at her, this small, wounded woman who had just faced death and was now offering him life. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. And in the dusty, blood-streaked light of the barn, surrounded by the wreckage of the past, he nodded. The ride back from Harmony Creek was a study in fragile, reclaimed intimacy. Jedediah Cain was securely bound in the back of the buckboard, unconscious and bleeding. A problem now for Sheriff Brody and the law. But for Clara and Elias, the outlaw had ceased to exist. They sat close on the wagon seat, Clara's head resting against Elias's shoulder, his arm securely around her. The silence that enveloped them was no longer an abyss of loneliness, but a quiet space for healing, filled with the immensity of what had been confessed and what had been survived. Back at the ranch, Elias led her into the house not as a master to a servant, but as a man cherishing something precious. He gently sat her at the kitchen table and, with a tenderness she had never witnessed in him, began to care for her wounded arm, his large, calloused hands that could break a wild horse and raise a barn, were impossibly gentle as he washed the gash with boiled water and clean cloths. Clara watched his face, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his lips were pressed into a thin line of regret. He worked without speaking, but his touch said everything. It spoke of terror, of relief, and of a deep, burgeoning love that he no longer had the strength or the desire to hide. She did not flinch from the sting of the antiseptic or the careful pull of the bandages. His quiet care was a balm that soothed more than just the wound in her flesh. Her recovery was slow, the deep cut leaving her weak and tired for days. During that time, the entire rhythm of the ranch shifted. Elias became her constant, quiet caretaker. He rose before dawn to do not only his chores, but hers as well. He cooked their meals, simple, often burnt offerings of bacon and beans that she ate with a grateful smile. He would bring her a cup of coffee in the morning and a glass of cool water from the well in the heat of the afternoon. He would sit with her on the porch, not in the stark silence of before, but in a new, companionable quiet. And he began to talk. He started with small things, memories of his childhood, stories of his first horse, of the father he had barely known. And then, carefully, hesitantly, he began to speak of Sarah and Lily. He spoke not of their deaths, but of their lives. He told Clara how Sarah had a laugh that could make the wildflowers seem brighter, how she had planted a small garden of herbs by the porch, the remnants of which were still choked by weeds. He told her how Lily, their daughter, had loved to chase butterflies, her small pigtails flying behind her, how she had a favorite rag doll that she took everywhere. He spoke of them not as ghosts to be feared, but as cherished memories to be honored. With every story, he chipped away at the wall around his heart, letting Clara in, letting the light touch the darkest corners of his grief. And Clara listened, her heart aching for his loss, but swelling with love for the man who was finally, bravely, learning to live again. News of the attack on the Thorn Ranch traveled through the valley with the speed of a prairie wind. Sheriff Brody, a man not given to embellishment, told the story simply and truthfully to anyone who would listen in the Harmony Creek saloon. He told them how Jedediah Kane, a known killer, had been found beaten and bound, and how Mrs. Thorne, that quiet, mail-order bride, had been the one to shoot him first, defending her home alone until her husband returned. The story transformed Clara in the eyes of the community. She was no longer a curiosity, a pitiful creature bought and paid for. She was a woman of substance, of courage. A few days after the attack, a wagon rumbled into their yard. It was Silas and Martha. Martha bustled into the house, carrying a freshly baked apple pie and a jar of beef broth, her face a mask of concern and admiration. She fussed over Clara's wound, clucking her tongue, but her eyes held a new, profound respect. While Martha tended to Clara, Silas stood on the porch with Elias, the two men speaking in low tones. Clara could not hear their words, but she saw the way Silas clapped Elias on the shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and friendship she had never seen between them before. A week later, when her arm was beginning to heal, they rode into town for supplies. As Clara walked toward the general store, the same women who had mocked her at the dance were gathered on the porch, but this time, their whispers were not of scorn, but of awe. One of them, a young rancher's wife, stepped forward. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, her voice hesitant but kind. We were so sorry to hear what happened. Are you recovering well?" Clara, stunned for a moment, managed a small smile. "I am. Thank you for asking." Even Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, offered a stiff, almost imperceptible nod of greeting as they entered the store. The judgment that had plagued Clara since her arrival had vanished, burned away in the fire of her ordeal, and replaced by the hard-won gleam of respect. She was no longer an outsider. She was Clara Thorne, a woman of the West, and she had earned her place. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The ghosts had not vanished entirely, but they no longer haunted the house. They were quiet memories, honored and at peace. Elias and Clara were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof. They were partners, in work, in life, and in love. They rode the fence lines together. They planned for the coming winter. They shared quiet smiles over the dinner table. The physical intimacy they had found was now matched by an emotional closeness that was even more profound. Yet, Elias knew one last ghost remained. The ghost of their beginning. The contract, the sale, the fact that she had come to him not by choice, but by circumstance. The knowledge was a burr under his saddle, a final piece of his past that he had to set right. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing he had built for her, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky, he took her hand. His own was trembling slightly. "Clara," he began, his voice low and serious, "there is one last thing we have to talk about." She waited, her heart beating a little faster. "When you came here," he said, his gaze fixed on their joined hands, "you came as part of a bargain, a shameful bargain that I took part in because I was a coward, hiding from life. I was wrong. What has grown between us? This is not part of any contract. It is real, and it is precious to me, more precious than anything." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes shining with an earnest, painful sincerity. "I love you, Clara. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone again. And because I love you, I have to set you free." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He placed it in her free hand. It was heavy with the weight of coins. "There's $500 in there," he said quietly. "It's everything I made from the cattle sale this year. It's enough for you to go anywhere you want. San Francisco, back east, wherever you desire. Enough to start a new life, a life of your own choosing. You can take the buckboard and hope in the morning. No one will stop you." Clara stared at him, her throat tight with a confusion of emotions. "Or," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, You can stay here, with me, as my wife, my true wife, in every way. Not because of a piece of paper your uncle signed, but because it is what you choose. The choice has to be yours. Clara, freely given. I will not have you trapped in my life. I will not build my happiness on a cage." He let go of her hand, creating a small, painful distance between them. "I will be heartbroken if you go," he whispered, his voice raw. "But I will let you. Your freedom, your choice. It is more important than anything." He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, turning his back to her to give her space, to hide the agony on his face. He was offering her the one thing she had never had, a choice. She did not answer him right away. She sat on the swing, the heavy pouch of coins a tangible weight in her lap. She could leave. She could escape this harsh land, this life of hard work. She could find a softer, easier world. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it, and she felt nothing but a hollow emptiness. The next morning, she rose early. She did not pack her trunk. Instead, she saddled Hope and rode out to the low ridge that overlooked the ranch. She sat on her horse and looked out at the land that had once seemed like her prison. She saw the cracked earth, the endless sky, the wind that still whispered its restless song through the sagebrush. But she saw it differently now. She saw the stubborn wildflowers that bloomed in the shelter of the rocks. She saw the hawk circling high in the clear, clean air. She saw the beauty in its strength, its resilience. It was not a desolate land. It was a land that demanded strength, and gave it back in return. She looked down at the small ranch house, a thread of smoke curling from its chimney. She saw the barn she had defended, the fences she had helped to mend. She saw the place where she had nursed a dying horse back to life. She saw the home she had fought for, and she saw the man who was waiting there, the scarred, silent man who had opened his broken heart to her. Her choice was not about safety or obligation. It was not about choosing a hard life over an easy one. It was simple. It was about love. She rode back to the house to find Elias by the corral, his shoulders slumped in weary resignation, his face etched with the pain of a sleepless night. He looked up as she approached, his eyes full of a heartbreaking question. She dismounted and walked straight up to him. She held out the pouch of coins. He flinched, his face paling, thinking she was returning it as a final goodbye. But instead of dropping it in his hand, she tucked it firmly into his saddlebag. "You will need this to buy seed for the spring planting," she said, her voice clear and steady. She looked him directly in the eye. "This is my home, Elias, and you are my husband." Relief washed over his face so powerfully that he staggered back a step. And then he was closing the distance between them, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her off the ground. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with the force of his emotion. They were married again 2 weeks later, on a bright, clear Sunday afternoon. It was nothing like the first time. They stood not in the shadows of the house, but on the front porch, under the vast, open sky. The entire valley seemed to be there. Martha stood beside Clara as her witness, her beaming face streaked with happy tears. Silas stood beside Elias, his weathered face split by a wide grin. Reverend Miller, his voice full and joyous, read the vows. When he reached the part about the ring, Elias took her hand. He slid off the old, ill-fitting gold band he had given her before. In its place, he slid a new ring, one he had commissioned from the blacksmith, a simple band of silver etched with the delicate shape of a wildflower. It fit perfectly. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared, "for the second and final time." The crowd cheered as Elias turned to Clara. He framed her face in his hands, his gray eyes, so long filled with pain, now shining with a love so bright it took her breath away. He held her like a man who had been given a second chance at life, a man who finally, truly believed he deserved it, and he kissed her, a deep, tender kiss full of promises kept and a future they would build together. The story ends not there, but weeks later, in the golden light of late afternoon, two riders move across the open range, their horses trotting side by side. Elias, tall and straight in the saddle, points toward a distant mesa. Clara, riding hope, her seat easy and confident, her hair loose in the wind, follows his gaze and smiles. They are not a man and his possession, but partners, equals, facing the wilderness together. As she looks at the scarred, beloved profile of her husband, a final, peaceful thought settles in her heart. He had once touched her as if she were his salvation, but now she knew the truth. They had saved each other. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so you can connect with other folks in our community. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.